You're probably not doing enough for HIPAA right now at this moment in time. Several times a week, I have people come and we have an initial consultation, and I ask them, well, what are you doing for HIPAA? How confident are you in your HIPAA plans? And they'll say, well, I've got notice of privacy practices, so I'm good. Or, I've got HIPAA compliant EMR, so I'm good. And that makes me cringe, and I have to kind of be gentle about it. But there's a lot more to HIPAA than a notice of privacy practices and getting a software that's HIPAA compliant. Now, when I say there's a lot more to it, that doesn't mean it's overwhelming or difficult to do. It just takes some time to kind of parse through it. If you can follow a checklist, you can satisfy all the requirements of HIPAA, no problem. So let's talk about how you can do that, well, how we can make it easier for you, and where you can maybe get started today if need be. So before we get into any of that, let's talk about whether or not HIPAA applies to you. Because I know there's a big contingent that says out there, and technically true, that if you don't submit transactions electronically, basically ask for money, then from an insurance company or from another third-party payer, then HIPAA doesn't call you a covered entity. While technically true, every state has security and privacy rules as well that help protect patient information. And those state laws are typically not spelled out with as much detail and don't include as many examples of what not to do as the federal HIPAA regulations do. And they still require you to make serious compliance efforts that are almost in lockstep with the federal rule as well. So the agreement amongst most attorneys that you'll talk to is if you follow HIPAA, you'll be pretty much really, really close to your state and state privacy and security rules as well. So in your practice, you should include reasonable efforts to create and maintain, and then most importantly, document, keep records of the culture of privacy and security within your clinical space. Most of these requirements of HIPAA, the minimum requirements, are also best practices if you're not technically under HIPAA. Now, at this point, I'll usually say if you follow college sports at all and you see where a program is not following the rules of the NCAA, there will be a report, and months later they'll say that the head coach is responsible because they didn't create a culture of compliance within the organization, even if they didn't know the actual infractions that were happening. So same thing here, your job is to create a culture of compliance. So let's figure out how to do that. Very, very beginning basics. At a minimum, HIPAA requires you to have appointed a privacy officer and a security officer. Now that can be the same person, it can be you if you're the only person in the company, but then you have to know what to do. So what is it that privacy and security officers do? Well, they oversee one, the creation and implementation of another requirement, the privacy and security policies and procedures manual that each covered entity is required to have. So I've had several other people contact me after OCR, which is the Office of Civil Rights, which enforces HIPAA infractions, has come to them after a complaint and said, show me your policies and procedures manual. And they didn't have one. So that's the first question that you will get if there's ever an issue. So putting one in place, one, meets the minimum requirements, and two, helps you sleep better at night as well. And putting it in place will actually prevent a lot of HIPAA issues down the road. So it's policies and procedures. So your company is creating policies. Hey, it's our policy that we want to comply with the Code of Federal Regulations as it pertains to HIPAA, for each of the regulations. And then what are the procedures that you've put into place in order to comply with that? It's one thing to say, yeah, we want to comply, but then if your actions don't follow up on that, then you're not really doing much in the way of compliance. And it's important because, as you probably well know from sitting through tons and tons of boring HIPAA PowerPoints and presentations from CMEs or maybe from your initial training, that HIPAA costs and fines can be really steep, up to $5,000 per record, per incident. So it's not something to take lightly. But again, it's not very hard to create a culture of compliance if you're willing to sit down and go through a checklist, that checklist being a policies and procedures manual. We have a template at Functional Lawyer. You can start there. It's pretty comprehensive. It covers the privacy rule and the security rule. There's about 80 pages of policies and procedures with another 50 pages of different templates and forms that hopefully you'll never need. But some of them include the notice of privacy practices, an accounting of disclosures, and many other privacy and security forms that your patients have the right to. So you may as well have the form when they ask for it. Another issue that you should do is, and you probably know well, is have all of your staff and workforce receive HIPAA compliance training, both once hired and then after that annually per year. And then part of your role, or the role of the privacy and security officer, is to perform a security risk assessment. So this is part of the rule, the HIPAA, HIPAA regulations that most people forget about. We think notice of privacy practices, PHI, don't disclose anything, and that we think that of that as HIPAA. And that is true, that's the privacy rule. But there's a whole other rule, it's about the other half of HIPAA that most people forget about, the security rule. And so that takes into account some physical, administrative, and technological safeguards that help ensure that the PHI doesn't get disclosed. So examples of physical safeguards would be locking the file cabinet or not allowing access for patients to just walk through the back half of the clinic where they might oversee or see clinical records of other patients. So not allowing them to walk back unescorted. Those would be physical safeguards, or keeping things in a locked closet as well. Administrative are things sort of like passwords, or restricting access to like the copier, which may have old copies or old faxes in it or laying around on paper, as well as making sure we destroy some of those records as soon as we don't need them anymore, instead of having them sit in a pile as well. And then technological safeguards are a lot of the security rule as well, which is encrypting your devices, having passwords, restricting access to accounts to people that only need to see it, and those sorts of things. So the security risk assessment is essentially you going through your security rule, your policies and procedures, and noting where there's any gaps. So if you see that you don't have an encryption on your computer, then you write down the gap. And where HIPAA is concerned, it's kind of like physics or math, where you need to show your work, and you'll get lots of credit for doing that. That helps document your compliance efforts, your culture of compliance. So even if there's a gap, that's actually good, because then you can say, oh, we identified this gap during our latest security risk assessment. We have identified a plan to address it within the next 90 days. And then 90 days later, we've addressed it. So that's a quick and dirty way to do your security, or explanation of how the process of a security risk assessment might go. And then last but not least, I would caution you to remember that HIPAA applies to practices of all sizes. The privacy rule especially does not matter what size practice you are, whether you are a solo provider or you're the biggest hospital system in your area. The security rule does have a little bit more flexibility depending on your abilities and your finances, but it still applies to you. So start with a policies and procedures manual. In it, it will force you to appoint a privacy officer and a security officer. They can be the same person, they can be you. Perform a security risk assessment at least annually, and then document and show your compliance with HIPAA throughout the year. And remember that it's not hard, you just have to kind of pay attention to it. And that goes for a lot of things. I'm glad you enjoyed today's video. My name is Scott Rattigan. I'm the founder of Functional Lawyer. If you like it, come on over to YouTube, subscribe, and do all the fun stuff, hit the bell, whatever they say on these videos. And we'll see you guys in the next video.